For decades, the world believed it already knew everything about the bond between Elton John and Princess Diana. Two larger-than-life figures. Two people who seemed to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders while somehow still managing to make everyone around them laugh. The public saw the photographs, the charity galas, the matching smiles at royal events. And then, on a grey September morning in 1997, the world watched Elton sit at a piano inside Westminster Abbey and sing a farewell that reduced billions of people to tears. That image became the defining picture of their story. But it was never the whole story. Not even close. Because behind the friendship that the world celebrated was something more complicated, more honest, and far more human than any headline ever captured. And in the years since Diana's death, through his autobiography, his interviews, and his rare but deeply personal public confessions, Elton John has finally told the parts he kept to himself for a very long time. To truly understand what these two people meant to each other, you have to start not with what the world saw, but with what it didn't. By the early 1980s, Elton John was one of the most recognized human beings alive. He had sold hundreds of millions of records. He had filled stadiums on every continent. He had built a persona so theatrical and so deliberately extreme that his very presence seemed to operate on a different frequency from ordinary life. But beneath the sequin jackets and the oversized spectacles was a man carrying an enormous amount of private pain. His sexuality, which he would not publicly address for years, was a source of constant media speculation and personal torment. His relationships were volatile. His dependence on alcohol and other substances was, by his own later and remarkably honest admission, accelerating toward crisis. The world looked at Elton John and saw a man who had everything. He looked in the mirror and felt something far lonelier than that. Diana Spencer entered public consciousness in 1981 as a 20-year-old who had agreed to marry the heir to the British throne. The press called it the romance of the century. The palace called it a triumph. And the young woman at the center of it stepped forward into a life that would demand everything from her while offering very little of what she actually needed in return. She was warm in an institution that prized coldness. She was emotionally expressive in a world that treated emotion as a kind of weakness. She had a natural and almost magical ability to make people feel genuinely seen, which is one of the rarest gifts a human being can possess, and she was walking into an environment that had no idea what to do with it. The fairy tale that the public consumed so hungrily was, for Diana, something considerably more difficult to live inside. When she and Elton first encountered each other properly in the early 1980s, at a royal event inside Windsor Castle, the thing that struck him most was not what he expected. It was not the poise or the beauty or the effortless way she commanded a room, though all of those things were present. It was her honesty. She was funny in the way that people are funny when they are not performing for anyone, when the humor comes from something genuine rather than something calculated. She asked real questions. She actually listened to the answers. She said what she thought. For Elton, who had spent years surrounded by people whose loyalty was conditional and whose interest in him was largely professional, that quality was almost shocking in its simplicity. Here was someone who was neither intimidated by his fame nor particularly dazzled by it. She just wanted to talk. And so they talked. And from that evening forward, something began between them that neither of them could quite have anticipated. Throughout the 1980s, as their individual lives became simultaneously more glittering and more privately painful, the friendship deepened in ways that the public mostly did not see. They appeared together at events and charity functions. They supported each other's causes. They spoke on the phone and exchanged letters with a regularity and a candor that surprised even some of those close to them. And they laughed, which perhaps sounds like a small thing but was not small at all given the circumstances. Both of them had learned, from necessity, to perform happiness for the world. What they found in each other's company was something different. Actual joy, the kind that doesn't require an audience. One of the most significant threads running through their friendship was their shared commitment to AIDS awareness at a moment in history when that commitment carried enormous personal and professional risk. The mid-1980s AIDS crisis was not only a medical catastrophe. It was a social one. The disease was surrounded by fear, by stigma, by a silence from institutions and governments that allowed it to spread while the people most affected by it were treated as though their suffering was somehow deserved. Diana, at the height of her public prominence, made the decision to visit AIDS wards. She sat at bedsides. She held hands. She embraced patients without gloves at a time when many people were afraid to be in the same room as someone who was infected. She did not consult the palace before doing it. She did not run the optics past a communications team. She followed what she believed was right, and she did it publicly enough that it changed the way ordinary people thought about the disease and the human beings living with it. For Elton, this was not an abstract political act. He had lost close friends to AIDS. The epidemic had cut through the communities he loved most deeply. He would go on to found the Elton John AIDS Foundation and devote extraordinary amounts of his time and fortune to fighting the disease. And watching Diana stand in those hospital wards, knowing what it cost her in terms of institutional disapproval, told him something about her character that settled into his understanding of her permanently. She did not do the easy thing. She did the right thing. And she did it with the kind of warmth that made it mean something beyond the gesture itself. Their friendship during these years was not all gravity, though. Elton has spoken with real delight about the lighter texture of their time together, the way Diana could take the most formal, stiff-backed occasion and find the absurdity hiding inside it. She had a gift for irreverence that she kept carefully tucked away in public but deployed freely among people she trusted. She loved gossip. She had a sharp and mischievous sense of humor that she exercised at the expense of pomposity wherever she found it. And she found it often, surrounded as she was by people who took their own importance with great seriousness. Elton, whose entire career had been built on a kind of joyful refusal to take anything too solemnly, adored this about her. He has recalled specific evenings, dinners, private gatherings, moments at the edges of public events, where she made him laugh until he couldn't breathe. Those memories, he has said, are among the ones he holds most carefully. But both of them were also carrying enormous private weight throughout this period, and the friendship bore the full burden of that without flinching. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was deteriorating visibly and then publicly, through a process that was both deeply painful for her personally and turned into a kind of public entertainment by a press that had no interest in her privacy. Her struggles with her mental and physical health were real and serious, and the institution around her was largely incapable of providing the kind of support she actually needed. Elton knew this. He saw it. And on his side, his own private crises were mounting. The addiction that had been building for years was consuming increasing amounts of his life. The gap between the person the world celebrated and the person he actually was had grown so wide it was becoming difficult to bridge. They knew these things about each other. They held these truths without judgment. And in a world where both of them were surrounded by people whose first loyalty was never entirely to them, that mutual knowledge was a form of safety. And then, in 1996, something happened that broke the silence between them in the worst possible way. Elton had been working on a charity project, a book of rock photography with proceeds going to AIDS research, and he had asked Diana to write the foreword. She agreed. Then, weeks later, she withdrew. A letter arrived from her office, polite in its language but cold in its effect. Palace advisors had objected to certain images in the collection and had made clear that they did not consider this an appropriate association for a member of the royal family. Elton was hurt, and he told her so. Diana, who was navigating one of the most turbulent periods of her entire life, her divorce from Prince Charles had just been finalized, she had lost her royal title, the ground beneath her existence was constantly shifting, responded with what Elton later described as a sharp and final letter. And then there was silence. Months of silence. Elton has been remarkably candid about the fact that this silence was not Diana's alone to own. He could have called. He did not. Pride, he has said, with a directness that is itself a kind of courage, got in the way of both of them. Two people who had built an entire friendship on the premise of honesty with each other had, at the first serious test of that honesty, both retreated into the most ordinary and expensive kind of stubbornness. He has not tried to explain this away or wrap it in something more flattering. He has said plainly that he was hurt and that the hurt made him silent and that the silence was a choice he made and regrets. Meanwhile, Diana was living through a year that had very little mercy in it. Separated from the institution that had defined her public identity for 15 years. Navigating a press that continued to pursue her with an intensity that was by any reasonable measure dangerous. Surrounded by people whose loyalty and motives were difficult to read with certainty. The fact that one of the genuine friendships of her life had gone quiet was not a footnote in that year. It was one more loss that she carried without complaint, as she had learned to carry so many others. Then, in July 1997, Gianni Versace was shot and killed outside his Miami home. He had been a close friend to both of them, and his death, sudden, violent, shockingly public, hit them each in a way that cut through everything. When Diana arrived at the funeral in Milan and saw Elton in grief, she did not hesitate. She walked over. She took his hand. She said it had been silly, all of it, and that she wanted her friend back. Elton has recalled that she managed, in the very same breath, to say something so completely unexpected and funny that he laughed out loud at a funeral, which was, he noted, entirely characteristic of her. That was how she worked. She could find the one crack of light in the heaviest moment and pull you through it before you realized what was happening. They made plans. There were things to say that had been waiting for months to be said. The friendship was being repaired, carefully and honestly, the way real friendships are repaired, not with a single grand gesture, but with a simple decision to begin again. Elton looked forward to seeing her. He was counting on the time they had promised themselves. 6 weeks later, in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, he was woken by a fax. He turned on the television. And the world that contained Diana was gone. She was 36 years old. She died in a tunnel in Paris, being chased through the dark by the same cameras that had followed her every step for 15 years. Elton has described the experience of that morning in ways that make it clear the shock never fully resolved itself into something manageable. She had been laughing with him at a funeral just weeks before. They had been planning to see each other. And now the phone call he had delayed for months, the conversation he had been looking forward to, was never going to happen. The grief was not only for her death. It was for the time that pride had stolen from both of them. When the Spencer family asked him to perform at her funeral, he agreed without hesitation. He and Bernie Taupin, his longtime lyrical collaborator, rewrote the words of a song Elton had first recorded in 1973, originally a tribute to Marilyn Monroe. The new version was addressed to Diana. It spoke of England's rose. It said goodbye on behalf of a world that did not know how to say it for itself. On September 6, 1997, Elton sat at a piano inside Westminster Abbey and performed in front of an audience that numbered, between the Abbey and the television screens around the world, in the billions. He has said repeatedly that this was unlike any other performance of his life, and his life had included performances of almost unimaginable scale and spectacle. There was no performance in it, he has insisted. There was only grief. His hands were unsteady. His voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with technique or showmanship. He was not a musician giving a concert. He was a man saying farewell to someone he loved, and the world was watching. The record that followed sold over 33 million copies and became one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. And Elton John has refused, consistently and pointedly, to treat this as any kind of achievement. He has said that he could not listen to it. That there was something deeply uncomfortable about a song born from that magnitude of grief becoming a commercial event of any kind. Every penny of his personal proceeds went to charity, to the causes Diana had championed, to AIDS research, to the foundations she had cared about. The money was never the point. The point was that she was gone, and no number of records sold would change that by a single thing. What Elton has done in the years since, across interviews and in the pages of his autobiography, is something that does not come easily to people who have lived as publicly and as defensively as he has for most of his adult life. He has told the uncomfortable truth about himself. Not just the grief and the song and the warmth of the friendship at its best, but the silence. The months when he could have called and didn't. The pride that sat between them like a wall while time ran out on the other side of it. He has said that if he could change one thing, not in his career, not in the decades of music and performance and spectacle, but in his actual life, it would be that. He would have picked up the phone. He would have said sorry first, because life, as he has put it with quiet plainness, is too short for pride. He has also spoken about his commitment to Diana's sons in the years since her death, a commitment he has described as something close to an obligation, not a public gesture but a private one, rooted in the friendship he had with their mother and in his understanding of what she would have wanted for them. When the pressures on her family have echoed, in ways both painful and obvious, the same forces that pursued Diana, Elton has spoken out without hesitation. It is, he has said, one of the things he can still do for her. The real story of Elton John and Princess Diana is not the song. It is not the funeral or the record sales or the iconic image of a man in grief at a piano. The real story is much smaller and much more honest than any of that. It is two people who found in each other a rare and genuine honesty, who laughed together in rooms full of people performing their own versions of dignity, who held each other's darkest truths without judgment, who, at one moment, let pride speak louder than love, and lost months they could never get back, and who, at a funeral in Milan, reached for each other's hands and chose to begin again, just not quite in time.